Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're starting off today's show by discussing the violence that's occurred in Northern Ireland for about a week or more. I know that there has now been, and there's been a pause requested as well and announced on the part of protests because of the death of Prince Philip. Nevertheless, it is important to understand why these protests and this violence took place to begin with. Many are talking about Brexit as being behind this, but then of course there is that entire context as well about the Sinn Féin attending a funeral and then not being held seemingly to account for that through the law. That has also angered people. But then within the Brexit concerns, there are two concerns seemingly. One is the border checks, as well as then the threat to possibly the constitutional position of Northern Ireland within the UK Union as a whole. So we've had both loyalists and nationalists, and those two terms I imagine will come up a number of times during this conversation. So loyalists are those, from what I've understood, are those who are aligned with the UK as in the Union as a whole, and nationalists are those who are possibly looking to join the Republic of Ireland, which is a country separate, of course, altogether. Let's discuss these issues a bit further. We're now joined by Deaglán de Bréadún, who is a journalist, author, and columnist with Belfast Daily and their Irish News. He's joining us today from Dublin. Also joining us from Dublin is David Kitching, who is Managing Director of Baseline Strategy. And finally, joining us from Belfast is Dr. Brendan Ciarán Browne, who is an Assistant Professor at the School of Religion as well as the School of Ecumenics at Trinity College, Dublin. Brendan, David, and Deaglán, thank you to all three of you for taking your time out to join us today. Brendan, if I may, I'd like to start with you. I know that there will be a bit of a pause because of the death of Prince Philip, but have we seen the end of this sort of violence, or is unhappiness with Brexit going to come to the fore again?
Thank you very much for having me on. In advance of coming on to the show, I spoke with a lot of community workers who are working on the ground in Belfast at the moment and who have been doing an incredible job to try and make sure that the level of violence that has been seen on our TV screens in the last number of nights is greatly reduced. As you say, there did seem to be a reduction in the flare-ups last night, although there were some clashes that took place in North Belfast, but they were reduced. And yes, on one hand, that is perhaps due to the fact that of the death of Prince Philip, but also I think due to the great work that's being done by community workers on the ground who are often marginalised and overlooked in terms of the good work that they do. Whether or not that this violence and this disorder continues is down to a lot of factors, and one of those factors is whether or not people come to the table and have serious, meaningful conversations around what is working and what is not working for many of the young people who are unfortunately being brought into this violence and who are being exploited for political gain. So I'd like to think that sensible heads will prevail, and I'd like to think that we can tone down the rhetoric and make sure that young people don't do engage in acts that really are damaging their futures. So it remains to be seen what happens over the next few days.
Okay. I wanted to get your thoughts on this then, because as Brendan there pointed out, one of the shocking things about this has been we've had children as young as 12 taking part in this sort of violence that we've seen on our TV screens. That's disturbing, isn't it?
I gather there are some children even younger than that, 9 or 10. Also, there's a criminal dimension to it as well, because as you will see in that piece by Lisa O'Carroll that you sent me earlier from The Guardian, there's resentment among criminal elements. So it's not entirely political. There is another dimension as well. It's very worrying. I mean, it's obviously we're all glad that there's a bit of a break because of the sad death of Prince Philip, but that will end. We looks like we'll be in for tensions now, building up to the 12th of July, which is a very big day for the loyalist unionist community. It celebrates the victory they had in the Battle of the Boyne back in 1690. You know, the past never goes away in Ireland, unfortunately, and that's a very tense period, and if this violence continues, it means that the 12th of July and that period is going to be particularly bad.
Yeah. So, David, one of the things that's caught me as interesting in this is that we've had both sides, right? Both nationalists and loyalists a part of this violence and protesting and unhappy with the situation at this point. So, as then the root cause, if we may discuss that, is it Brexit? Is it the Sinn Féin issue? What's really the root cause of that? I mean, the Sinn Féin issue may have been their attending of that funeral may have been, the one thing that pushed everyone over the edge. But was it actually Brexit which was the main issue and remains the main issue?
Hi, Waqar. I suppose in order to help your viewers understand the situation more broadly, you can look at this in both the local and general point of view. So, you see across Europe a greater degree of political polarization, and sometimes people put it down to economic anxieties, others to cultural backlash. Now, often these things intertwine, and cultural backlash tends to be the most potent of these. So there's an element to which these communities have been maybe left behind to a degree, and there's a long-standing history of maybe cultural anxiety within loyalism. As Deaglán said, it's a long history, and the past doesn't really go away in Northern Ireland. And as Brendan said too, these community workers are doing incredible work, but it's against a very challenging context. So there are several, I suppose, bogeymen at play here. So first of all, there's the relative position of the loyalist community to nationalism, and Sinn Féin post-Brexit have been quite vociferous in advocating for a border poll, so like a referendum on unity with the Republic of Ireland. And they've been pushing this envelope quite strongly. There's a good degree of resentment towards the Irish government and the way in which loyalism sees the Irish government having used the European Union and the leverage around Brexit to push a position. And then there's, of course, the UK government itself and the, I suppose, duplicity of Boris Johnson in promising certain things to loyalism, to unionism in Northern Ireland, and having no intention of following through on it. So this has created a greater sense of anxiety, and the Democratic Unionist Party have very much played upon this. They've really played the role of the political entrepreneur in all of this. Often quite short-termist, and and sometimes it's backfired on them to a large degree. But this is the overall reality, and Brexit really created a huge degree of chaos and of uncertainty. Indeed. In what was a very fine and delicate balance in Northern Ireland post Good Friday Agreement. So it really has been one of the primary kind of disruptors.
Okay. Brendan, I've read, articles blaming the UK government, and I've read articles blaming the EU as a whole, saying that, the EU put too much pressure on the UK to accept the deal in the form that again, the really sensitive issue about border checks, et cetera, for Northern Ireland / Republic of Ireland as well. Do you think that both sides, though, were in a very tough position when it came to that issue? Because, I don't think that there was, at least in my mind, from the as an outside observer, a very easy solution to that entire, problem anyhow, was there?
Well, no, there don't appear to be any easy solutions, but let's not forget that perhaps there was an easier package on offer at the beginning of the Brexit negotiations. That package that Theresa May brought before the House of Commons, which was rejected by the DUP, and which perhaps would have seen a much softer approach to Brexit. Now, I don't claim to be a Brexit expert in any way, and I think we need to be careful that we don't over-egg just how important Brexit is when it comes to this sort of outworkings of discontent. Today is the 23rd anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. It's 23 years since people in Northern Ireland decided that engaging in actual violence was not the way forward, and that there was an alternative. And I actually think we need to stop and take stock here and see what has really taken place for change in those 23 years. Of course, actual violence between communities has drastically reduced, and the level of killing and bombing has almost completely disappeared. And that is to be celebrated and never should be treated whimsically. But in that vacuum has emerged a structural violence. A lot of communities have really not benefited from the peace dividend. A lot of the communities that are experiencing these levels of violence, or a lot of young people, are not getting the benefits that were promised to them by the Good Friday Agreement. So I think we need to take stock of that. We need to look at how we regenerate and how we grow. And we need to look perhaps at what opportunities exist for this new, from Brexit, whether or not there's greater All-Ireland cooperation that can take place, or greater East-West cooperation that can take place. At the end of the day, this Brexit deal was packaged by the Tory government and sold to people in a way that is factually incorrect and untrue. And regrettably, it's the DUP that have a lot to say on that matter.
Deaglán, what are your thoughts about this then? When it comes to Brexit, the role it plays, the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, I know these, especially when it comes to the Good Friday Agreement, that's a very heavy-duty issue. I mean, does that need to be revisited in some way? I mean, how would that even work?
Well, just this day, 23 years ago, I was in Belfast covering the culmination of the negotiations and the conclusion of the Belfast Agreement, or the Good Friday Agreement, as it's also called. Now, it achieved a lot in terms of helping to eliminate violence. But it didn't do much in terms of social equality, and that's a dimension that needs to be addressed. There is a great deal of social deprivation in the loyalist areas, and indeed in the nationalist areas. And these youngsters are clashing with one another when they really should be uniting to get a better life for themselves and get more opportunities and build a future for themselves. Whereas what's actually happening is that a lot of them will be getting criminal convictions which will hang over them for the rest of their lives, you know. And of course, you've some experience of partition in Pakistan going back to 1947. Well, 100 years ago, the island of Ireland was partitioned, and then the northern section remained part of the United Kingdom. When Brexit was happening, there was a lot of worry that there would be checks on the border between the two parts of the island of Ireland, because that was a focus. Those customs posts were traditionally attacked by the IRA, nationalist guerrilla army. And now, so the solution was to have checks on the border, on the sea border between Northern Ireland and Britain. And the Unionists and Loyalists are worried that this is loosening their position in the United Kingdom.
So, David, how does one move forward then, right? Yes, we've had everybody, I mean, to their credit, of course, as you said, and as Brendan had pointed out as well, we've had a lot of people working to ensure that this violence die down. Everyone has condemned it. I'm speaking officially, as well as many grassroots activists also. But that doesn't resolve the grievances, right? How does one then move on to that step?
Yes, there are very many grievances entangled with each other. So I was very taken with what both of the other speakers have said about the structural violence and the levels of inequality prevalent in Northern Ireland. The thing is, across Europe, there's sort of a reckoning happening with how our democracies are functioning, in lieu with our economic model. So when you have structural weaknesses that treat communities as if they don't matter, that leave them behind when the rest of society more broadly can move forward, because there have been communities that have done well post Good Friday Agreement. Add to this that it's a post-conflict situation where you have communities who are being left behind, who are competing for limited resources, and there is a legacy of conflict, and there's a language and a symbolism thereof that people can turn to quite quickly. It makes it very difficult. So there really is a reckoning to be had in terms of how we structure, the conduct of democracy, the conduct of our economy in Europe more broadly, but more particularly in a post-conflict zone like Northern Ireland. And added to this, the model of democracy within Northern Ireland post-Good Friday Agreement, the type of power sharing agreement, it came with a good number of fudges for good reasons, just in order to make it easier to manage a challenging post-conflict situation. But it also has embedded this kind of entrenched position of nationalist versus loyalist, and it's been quite difficult to move forward from that. And you've seen over the course of the 23 years, in both nationalist and loyalist communities, the voting patterns have moved to the more extreme version. So it had started with the SDLP and UUP holding the main executive positions and that level of dominance, and it moved towards Sinn Féin and the DUP subsequently. And this also has exacerbated divisions.
Okay, so Brendan, who is in a position right now to be the one to be the leader in this situation? I mean, I'm pointing, of course, to the UK government versus the Irish government. Do you think it's a question of those two sitting together around the table? Is it about having more local leaders sitting around the table together? I mean, within Northern Ireland / even Republic of Ireland coming together and talking this out? I mean, what needs to then happen? Because again, I mean, just being happy that the violence ended in and of itself doesn't resolve the situation, right?
No, you're absolutely right. And anybody with any understanding of how peace was built in Northern Ireland, or relative peace, or whatever you want to call it, will be fully aware that it was about grassroots leadership coming together, but also being supported by the Irish government, by the British government, and external parties. We had good support from across the water in the United States, who were big sponsors of the peace agreement. And regardless of the rights and wrongs of all that, we have to appreciate that we do need to come together. We do need grassroots leaders to sit down with each other, and that is happening. And I think I really want to emphasise that point. There are so many good, on the ground, grassroots, cross-community organisations involved in work that doesn't get the spotlight that news shows want to highlight. I mean, there's an organisation, for example, up in North Belfast called Our City. Our City operates in one of the most socially deprived areas in Belfast, and brings together young people from the Shankill, the Woodvale Road, and from the Ardorn and further afield, brings them together, celebrates cultural differences, and highlights through youth work and youth empowerment ways that they can build a better community for their areas, and also a better life for each other. I've worked with that organisation for a while. I'm very privileged to see the work that they do on the ground, and it is genuinely transformative. So yes, we need political leaders to be political leaders, to actually not stir up discontent in Stormont, to not blame each other, but to come together. But equally, we need to be supporting the on-the-ground leaders who are doing the work day in, day out, and who don't always get that support.
Deaglán, we're running out of time, so I'll give you the final word before I let all three of you go. We've spoken then about the grassroots leaders, as Brendan there has mentioned as well, the positive of the work that is no doubt happening and has been happening throughout even this latest bout of violence that we've seen. Is that where the hope lies, in your opinion, as well? Because at the same time, as David has also mentioned in his answers, there is the greater context, unfortunately, of just, we've had this move politically around the world, in fact, not just within Europe, of people who are always, riding on waves of hate of some sort. Will that be able to be controlled within this situation?
Well, I think money has to be allocated to improve the position of people in these deprived areas, and a serious effort has to be made to encourage a more moderate leadership, as happened with the Good Friday Agreement, when people who were leaders of the IRA and the loyalist paramilitaries were drawn into the peace process and became committed to it. And, it's extraordinary to be looking at the footage of Martin McGuinness, who was a leading IRA man, meeting Prince Philip when he came to Northern Ireland in 2011. So that political side needs to be addressed. I think the EU, the European Union, the British government and the Irish government need to get involved to make the process of checks on the Irish Sea border a little easier and more relaxed. And also, it's encouraging that all the parties in the Northern Ireland Assembly have called for an end to violence. There's nobody supporting the violence. Yep. So I think that should be built on.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave there at that, but we really appreciate all three of our guests, Deaglán, David, and Brendan, speaking to us from Dublin and Belfast, respectively, sharing their expert insight with us about the situation in Northern Ireland. As I said, of course, the situation right now with the violence that we've seen has been both by loyalist as well as nationalist camps, and we've had very, very young children as well. I mean, Deaglán also spoke about possibly even children under the age of 12 who've taken part in this sort of violence, exploited, no doubt, because a child that young possibly and definitely does not know completely understand the context of what is happening around himself or herself. Nevertheless, it is time for those grassroots activists who have been able to seemingly bring down the temperature and have hopefully been able to have cooler heads prevail in the situation. We've had this pause now because of the death of Prince Philip. Possibly this is a good opportunity then for all sides to sit down and hammer this out, even at a local level. Hopefully the British and Irish governments can support this in that regard, because again, as everyone keeps saying, no one wants to go back to any sort of even semblance of what happened during the Troubles. Neither side wants that, by the way. So that's why we've had then politicians and officials on all sides condemning what we've seen play out there on the streets of Northern Ireland. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss a lawsuit that's been filed by the Muslim advocacy group, the American Muslim advocacy group, that is, called Muslim Advocates. And it's pretty much called out Facebook, as we know, for allowing a lot of anti-Muslim hate speech to essentially foster online. A lot of hate groups still very much online, even though the existence of them, as well as the use of hate speech against Muslims on its platform, is in fact against Facebook's own policies, which it has put out. So Muslim advocates calling Facebook out on that. This has happened in other places around the world as well. Just recently, we also had a Muslim advocacy group in Australia doing the same, calling out Facebook, in fact, through a letter, saying that it was also then threatening a lawsuit if Facebook did not act in this regard. And this has had very real-world consequences, right? Facebook has been used during hate crimes towards Muslims and even terror attacks against Muslims. There's Facebook Live, which, for example, the Christchurch terrorist had used while attacking the mosques that he attacked there in Christchurch as well, as just one example, of course, and this has happened in other places in other parts of the world also. Let's discuss all of these issues a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Sahar Khamis, who is a professor of communication at the University of Maryland. She's joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Joining us today from Kingston, Ontario in Canada is Dr. Adnan Husain, who is the director of the School of Religion, as well as the director of the Muslim Society's Global Perspectives Project at Queen's University. Adnan and Sahar, good morning to you both, and thank you both for joining us. Adnan, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this issue of hate speech, right? On Facebook, I mean, we're talking about specifically at this point, but just online overall, because the argument from the other side always, as you well know, is that of free speech.
Yes, well, normally I would consider myself a serious defender of free speech. It's good to have ideas contested. And I would note that a lot of the censorship that we see or the marginalization of speech tends to be against anti-imperialist political speech and advocacy, for example, pro-Palestinian advocacy. So it's, of course, something that we want to preserve. However, there's really a difference between incitation in hate speech that is a social danger and is essentially in a context. It has to be put into context, that when you have a context of inciting hatred and violence, that of course then it is a social problem and a legal problem that needs to be controlled. And I think the problem is that a lot of anti-Muslim bigotry and Islamophobia that we see so common and circulating widely on social media, on online platforms, has led, in fact, to an atmosphere of intimidation, abuse, and even overt violence, massacre, and killing of Muslims, not only in famous cases like the Myanmar military's use of Facebook to organize and incite purges and genocide in the country against the Rohingya population, but also in South Asia, in India, Sri Lanka. There are obvious cases with a lot of evidence of the way in which Facebook and other platforms have led to mass killings, murders of Muslims.
Sahar, what are your thoughts on this? You know, it's a balancing act, right? Where obviously, free speech needs to be preserved, but then at the same time, as Adnan there said, incitement needs to be called out.
Thank you for having me on the show. Absolutely. This is a very important issue that we need to come back to always and always discuss and consider this very important point. As a professor of communication with a special expertise in Arab and Muslim media, I can tell you for sure that the incidence of Islamophobia and hate speech against Muslims has been on the rise steadily, especially during the Trump era. For the last 4 years, between 2016 and 2020, we have seen a lot of increase, maybe I would say, multiple times over in terms of the actual spreading of hate speech and Islamophobia using different social media platforms. So let me talk about the double-edged sword of social media in this particular aspect. We can always think of social media as a double-edged sword in a sense that on one hand, it can give a platform for Islamophobes and those who are really white supremacists who hate Muslims and always spread this type of hate speech on social media, and definitely they have been on the rise. However, on the other hand, it does also provide a platform to push back against this type of hate speech by groups that are really advocates for Muslims, and some of these has started to be more active and more prevalent and more vibrant in social media platforms. I think they're taking good steps. Some of these steps are this group, Muslim advocates, in terms of trying to bring accountability to a social media giant like Facebook when it comes to what kind of content can be actually shared on these social media giant platforms. These are good steps in the right direction. Are they enough? Absolutely not. I think we need to do much more in terms of bringing up these important issues and debates and really trying to consider all of these aspects, including the very difficult and sensitive issue of quote unquote internet regulation. Who controls the internet? Up till this moment, we're always coming back and circulating back to this very important controversial issue of how and who can actually control or regulate this very broad cyberspace.
And Adnan, that's the key point, right? Because when social media first began, it was about being social, right? It was about connecting with people from across the world and exchanging ideas in this almost free market exchange of ideas, right? And it wasn't meant to be, of course, a breeding ground for hate, or it was in fact meant to do the exact opposite. It was meant to, in fact, at least in my mind, was meant to foster more understanding. How have we gotten to this point, do you think? That we're now, that Facebook is now, to an extent, I'm saying, even though it would claim that it's fighting this, that it's okay with anti-Muslim hate speech or incitement, in fact, to an extent that for Muslims such as you and I and others, that we would be uncomfortable having that because we know the real world consequences of that.
Well, yes, indeed. The promise of the internet was initially that it would connect people around the world and allow people to exchange ideas, experiences, get to know one another. It's almost that utopian kind of vision, and that is actually a vision that Facebook and Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, likes to promote, to immunize it against pressures to regulate. And I think the real problem is that the internet has become such a key feature of the economy that it is essential infrastructure in how we communicate, do business, educate ourselves, consume our media. And as a result, the profit motive and the concentration of power into the hands of executives of these high-tech social media platforms, that is the real problem, is that control is not democratic control. It is corporate control, and they have found that the algorithms that Facebook uses in its massive surveillance as well of collecting private data for targeted ads is that it likes conflict. It's interested in these polarizing dimensions. And the reason why we will not, I'm sure, see any meaningful regulation is because there's so much money to be made in a market, for example, like in India, which has now become Facebook's largest market for users, that you have far-right Hindu nationalist government that has bigoted anti-Muslim policies, and the nature of its politics is to suppress Muslims in India and their political rights. And there's so much money to be made. So until we confront the fact that not only is Islamophobia a big social problem, but that if this kind of social problem is also a venue for making an extreme amount of money, that we're fighting against not only the wrong ideas and the misimpressions, but also the profit motive. And that has something that has to be confronted very seriously.
Indeed, Sahar, not only is this about profits, right? I mean, because we've all, I'm sure, read that book about Islamophobia and how there are specific organizations, or many organizations around the world, that actually profit off of it. And that's not limited to Islamophobia, but just hate overall towards any other group. I mean, there are proper people that are making lots and lots of money to propagate such hate, A. And B, there are politicians around the world who are riding on that, right? I mean, Donald Trump may be one such example, but there are significant amounts of others around the world too, we can probably cite, who are in power simply because of hate speech towards one or the other. How does one tackle that? I mean, that seems like a huge maze to tackle, right? I mean, you can't tell a company not to make money.
Absolutely. These are all complex and interconnected and interrelated issues. You cannot separate one from the other. There is definitely the political aspect. There is also the communication aspect. There's also the economic aspect, like you rightly mentioned. We cannot separate this whole rising wave of Islamophobia from the wider global context of the rise of right-wing, politics and white supremacy. And as you said, Donald Trump is just one, but there are also those, Islamophobic politicians in Europe and other parts of the world who really kind of foster this kind of Islamophobic discourse, and they find also a platform and a room in many of these social media giants platforms like Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and others. In fact, interestingly, this group, Muslim Advocates, has actually asked Facebook before to block Donald Trump after the insurgency, after the attack on the Capitol on January 6, 2020. 2021, they asked him to actually, stop Trump from appearing on Facebook and block his appearance there on this social media giant. So there have been attempts to try to regulate this cyberspace, as we talked before, but let me also say it's not just about who is writing what. There are actual actions that take place in cyberspace which are very dangerous. Like, for example, the creation of what we call cloaked Facebook pages. Cloaked Facebook pages means accounts which are fake. People create some of these accounts, they use Muslim names or Muslim sounding or Arab sounding names, and then they create these particular accounts which are very dangerous because they foster hatred and Islamophobia and racism and xenophobia and all of these dangerous, hateful type of rhetoric and discourses, but under false Muslim accounts. And these are called cloaked Facebook pages. They are a very dangerous type of media content. And that's the type of content that groups like Muslim Advocates and others are calling Facebook and other social media giants like Twitter and others to try to block and to stop them. Until this moment, there hasn't been enough responsibility, I would say, on the part of these social media giants. In the past, they were able to dodge a lot of these, lawsuits and saying, this is just, social media users. They're just, basically uploading this kind of content. What can we do about it, right? But now the group is saying you have been breaching. You're talking about Facebook breaching some of these, for example, consumer protection laws, and saying you have a role that you must play. You should have responsibility. You should have accountability. You should moderate and regulate this type of content, and you cannot just basically say, oh, it's just, social media users and we can do nothing about it. So that's the debate and that's the controversy which is taking place right now. And as I said before, it is still a very controversial area. And up till this moment, the idea of who really controls this cyberspace is still a very controversial topic up till this moment.
To throw this into the mix as well, Adnan, one of the other controversies is the fact that there are still many people around the world, as I'm sure you well know, Adnan, who simply do not even sign on to the idea of Islamophobia to begin with, right? I mean, just very recently we had, I believe in the UK, a Tory government advisor who was telling essentially in private communication with Boris Johnson that Islamophobia in and of itself is a construct, as in it's not even a reality on the ground. So, I mean, in a world, I'm talking about the real world right now, not the online world, where Islamophobia as a reality is not even accepted, how then does one convince even in the online world, i.e. Facebook and these tech giants, that this is a reality that needs to be dealt with? And I mean, it sort of, to me at least, defies logic, because we're talking in a time where racism continues to be called out.
Well, you've put your finger on the real big problem here, which is that Islamophobia has yet to be understood and recognized for the form of racial and religious bigotry that it is, and that it in fact actually has an incredibly long history, particularly in Western Europe and North American societies, going all the way back to the period I really study, which is the medieval European history in the Mediterranean world, and the relations between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And what you notice there is that many of the tropes and motifs of contemporary anti-Muslim bigotry and hatred draw upon Christian polemic against Islam from the medieval period. And we see that contemporary far-right movements, some of the groups that Muslim advocates are concerned about operating on Facebook, in fact, actually use the history of the Crusades as a rallying cry, that they are situating their concerns and threats and hatred regarding Islam and Muslims in the long past. And they draw upon those images of crusades and a violent confrontation. So I think if we study history a little bit more, it's easier to identify the reality of Islamophobia as something very constitutive of politics and of one of the sources of white supremacy, actually, along with anti-Semitism and also subsequently with anti-Black racism. So I think the real test for Muslims is to learn this history and to connect and establish alliances of solidarity with other groups that are also contending against racism and bigotry, so that this problem of Islamophobia can also take its appropriate place and be analyzed and recognized.
Indeed. Work has gotten the best of us. We'll have to unfortunately leave it there at that, but we sincerely appreciate both Sahar and Adnan for taking their time out so early on Saturday morning to discuss this with us. We were discussing there, as I said, the Muslim Advocate organization, Muslim advocacy group based in the United States, which has filed this lawsuit against Facebook, saying that it's going against, in fact, its own policies of anti-hate speech, etc., and incitement, and is allowing for Islamophobia to foster online, specifically within certain groups and more generally also. I mean, there are many aspects to this, right? The argument on the other side is always free speech, but then you don't have the right to incite violence against somebody else. And there are limits to even free speech, as any logical person would accept. I mean, if anti-Semitism is a dirty word and anti-Semitism as a whole is unaccepted, as it should be, then why is Islamophobia not given that same recognition, understanding, as well as racism and hatred towards any other faith group or ethnicity as well? I mean, it should be across the board, right? And all of the above should be unacceptable in equal measure. And that's something that's really important to note in such cases. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.